This is one of my most favourite books. It's Madocks and the Wonder of Wales by Elizabeth Beasley. And within its 300 or so very well-written pages is a story about a couple of remarkable visionaries who helped change the landscape in this little part of Gwynedd. This is the main square in Tremadog, a town that really was the brainchild of a remarkable man, William Alexander Madocks, who was born in London in 1783, but came from a family from Denbighshire. He had an abiding love and regard for Wales, but especially this area here in the northwest, in what is now the county of Gwynedd. He lived at a time of really massive changes, as the country was moving from an economy based on agriculture to that of industry, at such a pace and at such a scale that by the middle of the 19th century it became the first industrialized nation in the world when there were more people either working in or dependent on industry than agriculture. It was also a time when tourism and travel were starting to take off for the more wealthy members of society, but there was also an important political and economic need for better forms of communication. And one of the most important routes was that between London and Dublin, especially after the Act of Union in 1800. And William Madocks' vision was to see the small port of Porthmadog on the Llyn to become the important place for handling that traffic. But that was not to be, because Holyhead subsequently became the main port. But his vision was that Tremadog should become an important staging point en route to Porthmadog. And so he set about building this town. But before he could start building his town, he had to enclose a large area of land from the tides that ebbed and flowed right up to the base of the steep cliffs. And this he did by building an embankment. Started work in 1800, employing 200 men to do so. At the same time, work was underway in converting a small cottage into this really lovely house, Tanarallt. And there are some absolutely wonderful references to it in Elizabeth Beasley's book. Among the references, the European magazine at the time wrote, and I quote, "Mr. Madocks' cottage was built more for a convenient residence than the splendour of show." And so many of the dozens and dozens of guests that stayed here commented on the magnificent view from this front looking down across the estuary. And William Madocks was a great enthusiast for roses, and he actually wrote instructions and saying he wanted thousands of roses to be grown here in this garden. And it was from here that he was able to oversee, between 1800 and 1811, the creation of what he called his new borough. But Madocks' dreams and ambitions have left us this truly wonderful example of early 19th century town planning. And all overlooked by the rather fine town hall that was also a dancing room and served as a theatre. Madocks just loved theatre and parties. I really think he must have been quite a character, because here we have a quote for him dated 10th of February 1810, and he says, "Welcome to Tremadog's unique chapel on the day of its opening. I, William Alexander Maddox, enabled the chapel to be built when I leased the land to the local Methodists. This chapel, which is larger than any chapel in Wales, reflects my ambitions for this town, that I'm building on land that I have reclaimed from the sea. And I think this is just such a very beautiful, elegant chapel. And if the chapel wasn't enough, he also built this rather splendid church, which is enhanced by this rather wonderful decorative entrance arch. And the detail and ornamentation is just absolutely superb. But William's religious endeavours was not without criticism, because the Bishop of Bangor, he wasn't at all happy about the fact that William was helping the nonconformists. But then he was somewhat placated when William Maddox explained that the church was built on rock, but the chapel was built on sand. I think it says much for William's character when he said that religion and education ought all to have fair play. He was certainly a visionary and was very well aware that the new town needed industry and commerce to survive. And so in 1805 he built the woolen mill, and along with a fulling mill and a corn mill that were all powered by water from a lake and a series of watercourses that tumbled down this hillside. He had great aspirations for this place because he named the roads Dublin Road and London Road. And he encouraged the opening of shops and pubs. And then, after his days here in 1839, along came Robert Isaac Jones to open his Cambrian Pill Depot. It's so easy when talking about people of great vision and enterprise to say that, well, for instance, William Maddox built this and he built that, or other people like Brunel built this or built that, and so on. But so very often, those great names, those great men, they had to have the help and assistance of other people with equal determination and tenacity. And William Maddox relied very heavily on another quite remarkable man, John Williams, who was born in 1778 to an Anglesey farming family. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any images of John Williams, but from the accounts about his life and the dozens of letters sent to him by William Maddox, I think John must have been quite a character. I think the memorial plaque in St. Mary's Church really speaks volumes about him. The fact that over 2,000 people attended his funeral is perhaps an indication of how he was perceived and a testament to his life. It's obvious that he and Maddox got on extremely well together, and right up until William's untimely death in 1828, they worked very closely. But there's no doubt that William could be a hard taskmaster on times. One of the letters he wrote to John, he said, "I am paying heavily every week for carpenters at the town and cannot find anything done. What have the town carpenters been about? Now do, once and for all, attend to this immediately and effectually." But I really mustn't be too hard on William, because it's obvious that he held John in very high regard and considered him a close friend. And rightly so, because not only was John responsible for the construction work here in Tremadog, but also for the work on the great embankment, but he also looked after domestic details in Tannerast, and he organised visitors and events in the town hall, looking after such a diverse group of people like poets, opera singers, theatre performers, etc. So he truly must have been a man of many parts. William's ambition was that Tremadog would become a really great, enormous and important town. And in some regards, that's materialised, because here we are in one of the pubs that he created, the Golden Fleece Inn. But it never developed into a major town, and that was because another one of his ambitions were realised that changed all that. And this is it. This must be one of the most outstanding examples of early 19th century engineering in Wales. This is the Cob, the embankment that stretches for just about a mile across the estuary of Afon Glaslyn. Elizabeth Beasley called this Cob one of the wonders of Wales, and I really don't think that's an exaggeration, because after it was built, it literally transformed the landscape and also helped in the creation of one of the most important harbours and boat building centres in North Wales in the 19th century. The early 19th century tourists wrote about the challenges of crossing the great open expanse of Porthmadog. One spoke about crossing in a leaky skiff with a strong gale against them, and there are other accounts then about people walking across the sand and then having to negotiate, wade through the narrow ribbon of water that was Afon Glaslyn as it flowed seawards. Elizabeth Beasley gives what I think is a lovely quote, a vivid description of this area, how it may have looked pre-embankment. And she said, "Each full moon, the spring tide transformed the Treith into a great inland sea, 5 miles across at its widest point. The valley was walled by sheer crags, which, rising precipitously from sea level, seemed much higher than they in fact were. To the north, as a stupendous backcloth, lay the Snowdon Range. The scale of the nearer crags gave it almost a Himalayan grandeur and added to the illusion of remote height." Goodness me, such a privilege to be here and look out across that magnificent view. And I just love the way that the clouds and mist roll across the mountains, ever changing the landscape with the vagaries of the weather. And weather was such an important factor at that time, because a bad winter and a wet summer could spell disaster, especially for poorer people. You know, hunger was never really that far away. So the need for good quality, productive farmland was so important. So enclosing the land was important for the long-term future of the area, and the construction of the Great Embankment, as Maddox called it, was such an important part of that, and I think also demonstrates his zeal for improving the prosperity and development of the area. Work began in 1808 and was completed by 1811, and as well as controlling the tides and river flow, the statistics are quite staggering. It cost £60,000 to build, which works out at about a guinea an inch, and if we translate that into modern costs, it works out somewhere in the region of about £5.3 million today. Well, to say the construction was challenging, I think is something of an understatement, given the hundreds of people who were employed. There were over 400 men at one stage, and also the huge quantities of rock and other material that was needed. And besides that, of course, there were horses and the wagons that were needed in the construction of this great embankment. And all that fell on the shoulders of John Williams, because at the time, William Maddox was away dealing with his work as an MP, and so he wasn't here 100% of the time, so it was down to the man on the ground. I think it's great that so many places today we can find these wonderful panels, these interpretive panels, which give us a potted history of the locality, and this one is a really very, very good example because it explains quite clearly what John Williams and William Maddox had to contend with. And also, what's really very nice is this illustration, which gives us a vivid description of what it was actually like to construct the Great Embankment. An extract from one of the letters that William Maddox wrote to John Williams gives us an idea of the kind of pressures that were on that man. And William wrote, he said, "You must do nothing else but write from 7 in the morning till you go to bed, and let the two ends of the embankment, that is, approach each other as fast as possible." And with almost superhuman effort, by midsummer 1811, the gap was finally closed and the Great Embankment complete. We're very fortunate that there are lots and lots of written references about the completion of the Great Embankment, and the North Wales Gazette, well, they really went to town, and they said, "To attempt to enter into the merits of the individual gentleman who had finished the great work with difficulties incalculable to the common mind, we feel ourselves inadequate to the task." And then they went on to talk about the activities that took place once everything was opened and working, and it said, "The lower orders, immediately with the native ardour of their ancestors, on Mr. Maddox's approach, took his horses from his carriage and triumphantly drew him over the embankment, which was, comparatively speaking, the work of his own hands." In September, a whole series of celebrations. There were parties, there were races, there were balls, there were religious services, an ox roast to celebrate the completion of the Great Embankment. And it was also noted that at one time there were up to 50 carriages of the neighbouring gentry actually on the embankment, and they were preceded by a silver band, by the town band, and followed by 300 workmen. Well, we're very fortunate that today everything is quiet and calm, but the weather and tides on this part of the coast are really not to be treated with contempt, because they can change so quickly and so violently. In February 1812, there was a wicked combination of a high spring tide and a howling westerly gale, to such force and effect that it actually breached the embankment and caused the water to flood in. That could have spelt disaster for the whole project, and many thought that the Cob was actually doomed. It was not to be, though, because John Williams sent messages across the whole of North Wales asking for help, asking for manpower, horses, carts, stone and other materials, and the response was absolutely overwhelming. When William Maddox first mooted the idea of building the embankment, well, of course, he had his critics and his detractors, but I think the response to the breaching of the embankment is an indication of just how attitudes had changed and how many people were now feeling very positive towards this incredible piece of engineering and this substantial area of land reclamation. An important part of the engineering work was the diversion of Afon Glaslyn around the rocky outcrop and the construction of a series of sluices. And the flow of water twice a day at the tides was to have an important side effect, which changed the history of this area. The flow of water scoured out a deep water channel, which was a fact not lost on William Maddox. Ever with his eye on the main chance, in 1821 he applied for an Act of Parliament to start building a deep water harbour that was named after him, Porthmadog. And this happily was coincidental with the massive expansion in slate quarrying and mining in Blaenau Festiniog. And in 1836, a horse-drawn railway was built across the Cob, and that was converted to steam in 1863. The worldwide demand for top-quality slate saw the rapid expansion of the town of Porthmadog and the harbour, and this evolved and developed into one of the most important boat-building centres in the 19th century, which of course is celebrated in this delightful maritime museum. And we get a really good idea of just how much land was achieved from this excellent map. And there's so much more to find out and learn about the history of this amazing place here in Gwynedd Maritime Museum in Porthmadog. Sadly, this chap, William Alexander Maddox, didn't live long enough to see all that happen, but I guess he would have been delighted to have realized that at least some of his dreams and ambitions came to fruition. John Williams did, however, live long enough to see how their combined efforts transformed this area. So, against this stunning scenic background, we have all these physical reminders of the vision, courage, tenacity, and sheer bloody-mindedness of two remarkable individuals. I would have liked to have met them. You know, this film has relied very heavily upon the excellent research and information provided in Elizabeth Beasley's book. Quite a remarkable story about a pair of remarkable men. Everything that they achieved was born out of their shared vision, their great respect for one another, and obviously a deep friendship. And Elizabeth Beasley, I think, perfectly summed it up when she wrote, "Their mutual love for Wales and faith in what they were creating was the great bond between them."